How did you know about this Korean War Veteran Digital Memorial Project?
You came into our meeting and introduced yourself and told us about it. And I thought it was a very good idea.
Could you talk about what is this meeting about?
This meeting is the annual convention of the Department of New York Korean War Veterans Association. And I am a director, on the board of directors of that association.
How do you feel about participating in this project to commemorate the Korean War veterans?
I think it is a very worthwhile project. I think we have to remember all of our veterans, especially those who gave their lives in Korea and those who have passed on since then. My name is George Covel. I live in Shushan, New York, which is where I've been since I retired. I have a wife and 5 children and 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. I went to college at Juilliard School of Music and then Hofstra College, which I left before graduation to enlist in the Army.
Wow. What instrument did you play?
I played tuba. First I went, after finishing signal school in Georgia, I was assigned to the 1st Army Band on Governor's Island in New York City. And then I came up on a levy for the Far East Command and wound up in the 8th United States Army Band in Seoul, which was the ceremonial band for the United Nations Command.
What was your first reaction when you heard about the Korean War broke out and you had to fight for it? Whoa.
First thing I did was look at a map to see where Korea was and what it was. Most of us were kids and we never knew what Korea was or where it was. I didn't go into the Army until 1952. I had been in the National Guard, so I had a deferment. I didn't have to go in. But I enlisted because I felt I should go.
How old were you? You didn't know where Korea was.
Didn't know where it was.
Could you elaborate on your sort of first kind of impression or thought about you were going to Korea to fight?
Well, early on, as a youth, I said, what the heck is wrong with Harry Truman getting involved way over there? You know, what does this have to do with us? But as I look back in retrospect, he did the right thing. And if I had to do it over again, I would do it over again. Even though I had a struggle over there. I had polio when I was 14, so 6 years later I was in Korea. And that's why I'm not one of the heroes on the front lines, because my physical profile would not allow me a combat assignment. So I was one of the fellows that stayed 11 miles behind the main line of resistance and did all the ceremonial work.
Destination.
I enlisted in the Army on June 2nd, 1952. I went to Camp Gordon, Georgia for basic training, and then they trained me as a high-speed radio operator, after which I was reassigned to the 1st Army Band as a bandsman. I was in the 1st Army Band until February of 1953, when a levy came up for the Far East Command, and I was one of those unfortunate ones who got assigned over there. My wife was 6 months pregnant at the time, but I wound up on a boat to Yokohama, a train ride down to Sasebo, and a boat ride across to Busan. I arrived there, I'd say about April 15th, and
1953.
1953. I got up to my 8th Army Band. I was second tuba in a four tuba section. And when the first chair rotated, I moved up the first chair and eventually wound up as a sergeant, E5. We were the ceremonial band for the honor guard of the United Nations Command. The honor guard consisted of an American platoon, a mixed UN platoon, and a ROC platoon, and the band. And sometimes we would do 2 honor guards in a day. And that's what I did until I came home. I was also, before the war ended, we had our own compound, and we had to set up our own defense. And
Where was that?
This was in Seoul.
In Seoul.
In Seoul. It was down near, I believe there was a place called the Queen's Palace, which was, you went down the main drag to the old Capitol building, made a right turn up to the university, and it was up that road down, I think it was called the Queen's Palace, we were near there. And I had to climb, every time there was a red alert, I had to climb a 25-foot tower and man a 50 caliber machine gun, which I never fired. And that's the closest I came
That's
to handling.
unfortunate.
Yes.
A little bit going back
Yes.
to the time when you had to leave your 6-month pregnant wife.
Yeah.
What did she say about it?
There was nothing much we could do, really. We went down to Washington. I tried to get a 90-day deferment just to be there for when the child was born, and it was turned down. So fortunately, she lived near my parents and also near the Naval Hospital, the U.S. Navy Hospital in St. Albans, and that's where she went to have the baby.
It must be very hard and difficult for her.
It was, but we've been married 60 years now, so she stood up well with it and raised 5 children.
Could you describe the first impression when you arrived in Korea? What was Korea look? What did Korea look like?
Devastation. It was very shocking. And I said, well, if this is what we have to do, I said to myself, if this is what we have to do to keep our homeland from looking like this, so be it. And really, they refer to Korea as the Forgotten War, but it was the first hot war of the Cold War. And it served notice on the Soviet Union that they could not overrun Asia, they could not overrun Europe, and they could not rule the world by us standing up. And it was the right thing to do.
While you were online, what kind of living conditions did you experience in terms of food supplies and a place to sleep and so on? How was it?
I was one of the fortunate ones. We had at first an old Japanese naval officer's quarters and a rehearsal hall, and we had cots. And being a ceremonial unit, we had so many dress uniforms and all, but we had houseboys that worked for us and took care of our uniforms and our quarters. That was good. The food where we were initially was not too good, and I'll be frank with you, the reason why was because the Honor Guard commander, Lieutenant Headland, was peddling food on the black market. He was selling our food.
Oh, that happens?
Oh, yes. You'd see the old Papa-san with the honey bucket going out the gate, and he also had an extra package back there with food that he was moving out. And the reason I knew that was happening was because we would have beef stew, and I'd speak to a friend of mine in the unit up the road, and they were having steaks. So you can get a lot more beef stew out of less steaks than you can.
Oh, that shouldn't happen.
Yes, but it did.
Do you remember the name of that house?
My houseboy?
Yeah, houseboy.
My houseboy was Young Byung-ho.
Wow, you remember this?
And yes, and I admire those boys tremendously. They were their fathers were off fighting in the Rock Army, so they were the man. He was the man of the house, and he provided by working for 6 of us. He made $60 a month, plus I gave him my cigarette ration so that he could peddle it on the black market. And his mother did my laundry, and they came in every morning, cleaned up, and then they went to school in the evening. So these boys did not ignore their education. They worked hard during the day, and they supported their family. So that's why I remember Young Byung-ho.
Were there any Korean soldier, Patusa, working with you or with your unit?
We had one Katusa, Mr. Oh Byung-do, and he was a flute player, and he was actually a civilian. But we had the rock platoon was attached to us, the whole rock platoon. And I saw them progress from a bunch of people that didn't know the right foot to their left, from their left foot, to a platoon of crack honor guard soldiers who did the drills and everything perfectly. But of course, as I'm sure you know, the discipline in the Rock Army was a lot harsher than the discipline in the American Army. So,
could you describe the most difficult and happiest moment in your service during the war?
The happiest moment was when my buck slip came down saying, "You're rotating next week."
When was that?
That was, let's see, I landed back in the United States April 25th, 1954, and it was 17 days across so it was probably about April 1st. And
1954.
1954, and it wasn't a practical joke, an April Fool's joke either. It was true. I know because I celebrated at the NCO club that night, And I felt the after effects of that celebration for a few days afterwards.
Most difficult time that you remember?
The most difficult time was when I think I was hospitalized. They thought I had appendicitis, and it wasn't. It turned out that I had intestinal parasites, and they have been with me to this day.
Mm-hmm.
I still suffer periodic episodes of that problem.
So did you experience real battle against Chinese or the North Korean soldiers?
The only time I fired my weapon was on the way from Busan to Seoul. As we passed, I can't remember whether it was Daejeon or Daegu. There was a guerrilla attack on the train in front of us, and they were still firing, and we had to get off the train and defend the train. But that was only about 15 minutes to a half an hour at the most. I have problems, a neurological problem with my right arm. I don't know how it happened, but it flared up from Korea. I have no sense of pain in that. And of course I wear hearing aids, but other than that, I was one of the fortunate ones, and I thank my lucky stars.
Good for you. So, since you left Korea in 1954, you must have experienced the armistice signed in July 27 of 1953.
Oh yes, I know that very well because...
Could you describe about when you hear about that news?
The week before, I met a friend of mine from high school who was at the communication center in Uijeongbu, and they handled all the traffic from Panmunjom. And he'd come down to visit, and we were chatting about the possibility of an armistice. Well, the Sunday of the armistice, he called me up about 2 in the afternoon, and he said, "George, remember what we talked about last week? Remember?" And I said, yeah. He said, "Tonight, 5 o'clock and 10 o'clock. Which meant that at 5 o'clock they were going to announce it, and at 10 o'clock it was effective. So I knew then and there, and I came into the barracks, and I said, "Fellas, the war's going to be over tonight. The armistice is going to be signed." "How? No, you don't know what you're trying." So I made a few side bets, and at 10 o'clock, at 5 o'clock and 10 o'clock, I collected the money. And how did you know? I said, "I had my own G2 section." And that was it. That was how I knew it. And then shortly after that, the really rewarding times were about a week later. We were called for, normally we had notice of honor guard formations. This one was a very short notice. We have an honor guard, get up to, we're going to be up at the university. We went up there, and General William Dean, who had been captured early in the war, had been released. And we were standing in honor guard for him. And I remember he came through the ranks, shook hands with every one of us. "I'm so glad to be home. I'm so glad to be home." And shook hands with me, shook hands with all the soldiers in the American platoon, all the way down the line. And and then later, we went up to Panmunjom and did Operation Big Switch and Little Switch, which was the release of our prisoners. And there, I met a fellow came across and shook hands with me. He had been a tuba player in the 8th Army Band, and he had gotten captured in the last time the North Korean and Chinese came through Seoul. Somehow he didn't get out in time, and they captured him. So he'd been a prisoner of war for a couple of years.
Oh.
I think he's the only bandsman in the whole Korean War who was a prisoner of war.
Have you had chance to write back to your family, your wife, about this armistice signed, or any other occasions?
Yes, I did.
Could you share any story with us?
I wrote to her and told her about it. And, I always considered my wife to be a Korean veteran because she gave up an awful lot during that period of time. And alone in a big city with raising a newborn baby on a private and then a corporal and then finally sergeant's pay. And we wrote back and forth and told her what was happening. And, of course, she was so happy to see me when I got home. And I called her up from San Francisco and said, "I'm off the boat. I'm waiting for a plane to go to the East Coast and discharge." And it was wonderful. Then a year later, our son was born.
Oh. What was the reaction when your family or your friends first saw from coming back from Korean War? What do they say about?
Well, my mother wanted to have a big dinner for us, and she was going to get a nice big rib roast or some nice steaks. And I said, "Mom, I have plenty of beef over there." She said, "What do you want to eat?" I said, "Swordfish steak. I haven't had good fish in a year. I'd like a nice fish dinner." She was shocked, but... And also I said I want fresh milk, because over there we had milk, it was powdered milk reconstituted, so there was plenty of chlorine in it. And you haven't lived until you drank chlorinated milk or had chlorinated scrambled eggs. and that included powdered eggs with chlorinated water and all. It was an experience. So that was what I was looking forward to: fresh eggs, fresh milk, and some fresh food and some seafood. Our generation was sort of the tail end of that, and I think the American people were probably weary from World War II, and I think that had a lot to do with, don't tell me we're back in a war again, and I think that was a lot of it, especially when they figured, hey, we weren't attacked. There was no Pearl Harbor. We were coming to the aid of a country that was. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, I went back to Korea in 2000 with my wife, and I see what was done, and I said, it was worth it. These people were worth it. And I have the highest regard for the Korean people.
Thank you very much. Next year, 2013, will celebrate 60th anniversary of Armistice because it was signed July 27 of 1953. There is no war lasted more than 60 years after the official ceasefire. What do you think we have to do about this? We are technically at war currently, and if there is a petition to sign to replace the armistice with the peace treaty, are you willing to sign it, or could you describe about your thought on the 60-year-old armistice?
I think a petition would be an exercise in futility unless you get China. China is the key to the whole thing.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about actual peace treaty, but for symbolic reason that the Korean War veterans in the United States and the soldiers who participated in the Korean War symbolically suggesting that we want to end this war while we're still alive. We want to see the end of this. We want to wrap this up. What do you think?
I'm all for it, but as I say, I don't think it will happen in my lifetime until China agrees. They're the key to the whole thing. I do a lot of reading, and one of the last books that I read was Mao's biography. It's about that thick. It was a red cover. It was written by a Chinese author. And the most interesting part was the chapter on Korea and the Korean War. And you see how much control they had. If they pull their support out from under North Korea, I don't think Russia would object. And then North Korea is going to have to come to the table.
What was the overall impact of your service to the Korean War upon your life back in the USA? How do you think that your time in the military influenced your life, your family?
Well, I don't think I would have gotten married as soon as I did. And when I came back from Korea, the GI Bill for the Korean veterans wasn't as generous as the previous one had been. So I didn't feel that I could get back to college and continue studying music as a career, that I could support my family with music as a career. So I decided to make a career change. I had a family to support, and I had to get out there and do something. And I became a court reporter. And I had a very rewarding career. I was fortunate that I made enough of an income that my wife could stay home and be a full-time mother and raise the children. And she did a wonderful job. And now we have 9 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. So it's been a rewarding life, and it's had a blessing. It's been a very rewarding experience, and I think the Army and my service in Korea had a lot to do with it, because actually it made me grow up. We went into the war as kids, and we came out as men. And that, I think, was the most important thing.
I remember in the very beginning of this interview you mentioned about the importance of the Korean War in the Cold War context, yes, international politics. Could you describe or share your thought about the legacy of Korean War veterans more in detail?
The legacy of the Korean War veterans? That's an interesting question. Our legacy was a notice on the Cold War, on the Soviet Union, that there's the line in the sand. You cannot cross it. And they didn't. I think it proved itself in the Cuban Missile Crisis. They realized that this is a powerful nation. And it was a lesson that the Japanese people learned the hard way, and that Hitler learned the hard way. And I don't think the Russians, especially the Soviet Union, I should say, after the losses they had in World War II, wanted to risk that again, especially in a nuclear confrontation. So our legacy was that it brought a relative peace to the world, a relative peace. We're not yet at peace, but maybe in my lifetime we will see peace. I hope and pray for it. It woke up the American politicians to end our disarmament and rebuild our armed forces. And that was it. You know, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Speak softly but carry a big stick." We suddenly had the big stick, so we could then negotiate. And since then we have negotiated the SALT treaties and the nuclear test ban treaties and so forth. But we did that from a position of strength, our powerful armed forces, and as was demonstrated initially by our armed forces in Korea. We showed them that, hey, we took a licking for about 2 months, but then we got off our backsides and came back at you and showed you what we can do and could do. And I think if there hadn't been some stupid decisions made in Tokyo by General MacArthur's staff, we would have maybe stopped at Pyongyang and not gone any further, and the Chinese might not have come in. Because there was ample notice, if you read history, that the Americans were notified, hey, you come to the Yalu, we're coming in. Pyongyang, I think, was far enough. We didn't have to go up to...
Any message to those future generations who will listen your interviews?
Don't forget history. I think it was Santana once said, if you forget history, you're doomed to repeat it. And Churchill paraphrased it, and you learn from history, learn from our interviews, and don't make the mistakes that we made, our generation made. That's all I would say to them.
That's a great message.
Thank you, Korean War veterans. And the Rock Navy Honor Guard stood there presenting arms, saluting us. And even the jarheads, I mean the Marines, had tears in their eyes and were choked up. And we had Korean War veterans sign on our bus as we went around. And every Korean in uniform, I think even the mailman, came to attention and saluted us. And I've noticed, particularly among the older Koreans, that they would say, thank you for helping to save my country. That was brought to me, really, my son lives in Alaska, and he was working for the Forest Service at the time. The Korean, one of the Korean companies was exploring a mining proposition up there in the Chugach Mountains, and my son had something to do with it. And he introduced me to them, and when they heard I was a Korean veteran, thank you for helping to save my country, and shook hands. And that was very rewarding, especially in this area. We have a very large Korean community in the Capital District, and every summer they have their picnic. Korean veterans are invited, and they're told first online for the food, and they have a banquet in the winter. Korean veterans are invited as their guests. They have not forgotten. We should not forget.
Right. Enemies of Chinese and North Korean soldiers, if somehow the meeting is arranged?
I would have difficulty with the North Korean soldiers, because, and actually I should say that with a little bit of hesitation, because the actual grunt, the private, he was taking orders. But I had a high school classmate who was found in a tunnel with his hands tied behind his back and a bullet through his head when the North Koreans came in. I understand when the Chinese came in, they would take prisoners. Sometimes when they saw a wounded guy, they would treat him, or sometimes they said, get out of our way, just that they were not as brutal. So I would have no problem shaking hands with the Chinese. The North Korean soldiers, there's a little hesitation there because of that reason. Back from Korea, this last visit, I went down to see the memorial, Korean War Memorial in Washington. And there was a fellow a little bit older than I, staying there looking at the wall. And I went up to him and I said, what outfit were you in? He said, I wasn't. My son was killed in Korea. So I told him, I said, in Seoul, there is the War Museum. And there are colonnades leading into it. And on one colonnade, there are bronze tablets with the names of all the Korean War dead, by state, the Americans by state. I said, so your son's name is there. The Korean people have not forgotten him, and they honor him. And there's a big book at the end with all the names there. And the Korean people have memorialized his name. They have not forgotten. And we stood there looking at the wall for a while, and then when he left, we both had tears in our eyes. He patted me on the shoulder and he said, thank you.